are 1 minute ahead of beginning, 7 p.m. Good, friends. Welcome to the Panda Hub, and welcome to this session. I am so delighted to be here with a good friend, Todd Stern. We will have a fireside chat, so it will be like a very interactive conversation because of a great book. It is a 276 pages. You can see here the front page of the book, Landing the Paris Agreement, how it happened, why it matters, and what's next. So like three times, no? Why it happened, the past, the Paris Agreement itself, why it matters, and what's next. So important for the current times, Todd. So I think that I don't remember when we met, but we were together in COP20. That was
Yeah,
10
sure.
years ago.
Yeah.
Because Todd used to be the chief negotiator of the US in the climate debate for a long time, and you can see it in the book. So let me start with a very simple question. Todd, when you started to work on climate, so when it was your beginning to work on climate, and why?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I didn't come to this with any background. I wasn't an environmentalist. I cared about the environment, but it wasn't the thing I focused on. And I was one of these people. I mean, I was a lawyer by training, but I wanted to get into the political and policy world, and I did that, and found myself in the Clinton White House, and from the beginning. And in 1997, in the summer, the chief of staff asked me to come down to see if I could give some of my time to help prepare for Kyoto. But I didn't know anything about climate change. I met a lot of people, and I was part of the group that was figuring out what the U.S. target was going to be. So that was my introduction, and then after Kyoto, they asked me to be the coordinator for the whole administration, which I did for another year. So I was also in Buenos Aires for the COP in '98. And then that was it for a while. I continued to stay involved in climate change. I wrote a number of articles. I worked with John Podesta at his think tank, the Center for American Progress, on the side. I was at a law firm. In the interregnum between Clinton and Obama, I was in a law firm, but I also worked with John. So I kept active on climate, and when Obama won, and I knew Hillary Clinton from the Clinton White House, they asked me to come in to be the special envoy, and so that was great.
You know that I don't know why we, the lawyers, we always have that courage to jump into different topics, despite that it is a new topic. But it is fantastic. Why do you think that is so characteristic for lawyers?
I guess because you've got to be ready for whatever case comes at you and whatever issues, and you sort of learn a certain kind of thinking and writing that's useful.
Yeah. And you know, Todd, that something that I have seen in your book, it is that you believe on process. So when it is about the climate process, the climate talks, despite of the difficulties, you have always tried to push the process forward and to see how much else it could be reached, how much this kind of process are resilient, because we are entering into difficult times, and how much the resilience of a process, it is important to keep alive the promise that we did.
Well, I mean, it's crucial. I mean, unfortunately, situations change. I'm afraid they change more dramatically in the United States than most places. So we've already been through this exercise of Donald Trump pulling us out of the Paris Agreement once before. We very unfortunately, and in ways that have produced a lot of distraught people in the Biden and hoped for Harris administration. We're having that again, and we're going to just have to face it again. And there were a lot of very positive activities that sort of sprang up out of nowhere. Within a day, actually, they started to happen the first time in 2017. And so there's a lot more of more experience in terms of what to do, and it's going to be important that all of the action that can happen at a non-federal level. So there's not going to be much action at the federal level, but states and cities and NGOs and companies, it's going to be crucial that there be really aggressive action on climate in the United States, and I'm quite confident there will be.
No, and that is true. That at that time it used to be called that we are still in campaign, show to be so instrumental to keep the U.S. actively in the debate. Now it is America is all in. So probably we have to do the same, but let's keep that for what is next.
Okay.
So something that I do want to highlight, Todd, because it is in your book, it is that there was some time in which you was looking to bring the U.S. more actively to the debate, but in a way in which you were recognizing the political reality of the U.S. So you were looking to get something, but on the other hand, not to go back home to get probably a refuse or of the Congress. When you realized that that would be the way, so how to connect a process, but also your domestic reality?
Well, so go back to 1997, then my first COP was Kyoto, and I got suitably scarred by Kyoto because it was an experience where the United States negotiators, and I was the representative from the White House, but I was so new that I wasn't really one of the negotiators, but the negotiators and the leadership in the U.S. group said yes to the agreement, but there really was not a chance in the world that it was going to be affirmed, confirmed by the Senate, which is, the U.S. is the only country in the world, as far as I know, where you have to go back to your legislature and get a 2/3 vote to support not all international treaties, but depends on the nature of the treaty. And in the case of Kyoto, it was one of those agreements. So we had no chance. There was a lot of opposition to climate change back then in the Senate and the House. So we really had no chance to get that done. And that experience led me to come into my new job, a number of years later, with one absolutely hard and fast conviction, which is that I would not allow the United States to say yes to an agreement that we could not join.
Yeah.
So that was sort of my core belief coming in, and so you're absolutely right. If you look at our first year there with Copenhagen, you will see that there was a kind of existing paradigm, what people expected out of the negotiation that was going on then, that was supposed to end in 2009, started in 2007. And it was not exactly Kyoto, but it was close to Kyoto. And we couldn't accept that. So we had to work, we didn't come out with punch somebody in the face right away. We had to work kind of gradually and with Denmark, but to approach things in a different way.
And did you ever heard voices saying, no, you have to go to the parliament? There were that debate internally, or it was clear that...
Not internally, lots externally.
Okay.
Yeah, Europeans were very unhappy with us. Most countries were very unhappy because not unreasonable on their side. Their conviction was that a legally binding agreement would be the strongest. Climate change is a really serious problem. We needed a legally binding agreement. They didn't have any of the obstacles that we had there, and so I didn't criticize anybody for having that view. I just couldn't accept it. So we had to work with a lot of different parties over time but the most important actually was Denmark.
Yeah. And you know that we are always thinking that a legally binding, it is like a stronger piece. But when we got, it is not for the climate debate, but when we adopted the Rio Declaration in Rio 92 with this principle, probably that has been historically one of the most important milestones in not in the climate, but in the environmental debate.
Yeah.
No? So it is not that we do need to have a legally binding thing. No?
It all depends. Some of the most important agreements, the one that you mentioned, but also human rights and other things in Europe have been very influential without being legally binding. The other thing is, if it's legally binding, don't think that there's necessarily going to be some kind of punishment if you don't do what you're supposed to do, because that's a whole other issue. And the notion that we were going to get an agreement where all countries agreed that there would be sort of punishment for not doing what you're supposed to do. That wasn't going to happen. So the difference between legally, there's some difference, but I always thought that it wasn't going to be a large difference.
Yeah. So that is a very important message for the non-lawyers. No, it is not that we have to always get a legally binding thing. It depends. No, it depends on what. How can we call that? A political realism.
Yeah,
in
I
some
think
way.
so.
No?
I think so.
It
Yeah.
is what we do need. So we all knew the importance of having the U.S. being active in the debate, also to join what it would be the agreement that fortunately we got. But also you are in your book referring to your role to rebuild U.S. credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why? And what kind of, I don't know, mechanism, ways you use to rebuild that credibility?
Yeah, so one thing just before we leave the legally binding issue, Paris, and we'll probably get there later, but Paris is a half and half. It's a hybrid. Some of it's legally binding, some of it's not. That's one of the innovations of Paris. But so I'm sorry, so the question...
The U.S. credibility.
Yeah,
US credibility.
so...
That is something that we are referring to.
Yes. So, so we came in at a point, so this is 2009, President Bush, the second President Bush, the Bush the younger, came in 2001 till 2009. And he had started off his administration by removing the U.S. sort of unceremoniously from anything to do with ongoing conversations that related to Kyoto. And you know, I don't really criticize the notion of the U.S. I mean, as I already said, the U.S. couldn't join Kyoto, but Bush did it in a very kind of hard, undiplomatic way. And then throughout his 8 years, there was very little done with any thought or recognition of climate change, so that the U.S. was kind of just out of the discussion for those 8 years. I refer to those years as the 8 lean years in the book. And so when we came back in, there was actually a tremendous amount of hope and excitement generated by President Obama, just because of who he was. And I decided to go to the first, so I'll back up 1 second. There are the big COP meetings at the end of every year. You guys probably know this. We're here now for one. But there are also intersessional meetings that take place during the year. And those are below the minister's level. And I was essentially the minister for the United States. And so the first intersessional for negotiators was happening at the end of March, and I decided I would go, even though that was the only time I went to one of those meetings. But I wanted to go and show people by my presence and be able to take the microphone and talk to everybody in that room, all countries, that the U.S. was back and that we intended to play and that Obama was committed. And I got a standing ovation. So for two things, I got a standing ovation. And then I said to my 2 chief aides behind me, I whispered and said, enjoy that, because that's the last standing ovation we're ever going to get, which was true.
And Todd, before moving into some of the elements that move us towards Copenhagen, let me ask two simple things. Because you are referring to your team at that time, Sue, Trick, among many others in your team. How important it is to build a strong voice with a good team that can play different roles in this climate debate?
Well, it's just essential, and the U.S. team was really outstanding. You mentioned probably the 2 most outstanding, experienced people in the group. They're still here, by the way. They're up in the U.S. office right now working, and Sasu Biniaz is absolutely brilliant and an uncanny ability to find the words that can get 2 sides who are kind of close together but can't quite get it done, and she is quite brilliant at finding the way to move forward. Trig has been around forever. He's got tremendous kind of knowledge. He's got great judgment. He knows everybody. And then we had a whole team of people along with them. No, it's crucial because, I mean, as the leader of a group, there's only so much you can do. You can't be everywhere, and there's always, maybe less now because we're working off of a mostly done agreement, but there were many issues on the table in Lima, in Paris, and so we had different people covering all these different issues. And the U.S. always had a lot of respect as a team of negotiators, which, by the way, is one reason why, going back to where we started with Trump leaving the Paris Agreement in 2017, the career staff of the climate office at the State Department kept working. And they kept working in a way that they were really appreciated. Even though Trump had, taken us out, they were appreciated for their expertise and for how they could help reach an agreement. And one of those guys, a young lawyer, was one of the two facilitators, along with a Chinese counterpart, on the guidelines for the transparency section. There's a transparency section of Paris, so the guidelines were worked out over the next 3 years. And they were the two facilitators, even though Trump was pulling us out of Paris. So that was possible because people really have respect for the expertise of the U.S.
And Todd, it is so important to recognize those people.
Yeah,
no? Because I am a
absolutely.
good friend of Trick Haley, and he stayed during the Trump time.
Yeah.
No, and also he used to be very active during those times and facilitate things and move things forward.
Trig was in charge of the whole effort at that point.
Sure. And those are things that we are used to forgetting. No, and we do need to recognize that people that with courage stayed in so difficult moment, because that is what this debate needs. So let me move into before Copenhagen is coming, one by one. So it's so interesting, all your reference to this kind of friendly diplomacy within difficulties with China, for example, the relation with Minister Xie.
Yeah.
No, that it has been so instrumental to give good signals to the process.
Well, my relationship with Minister Xie was one of the most important elements of the whole 7-year negotiation, and one of the most, I don't know if I would say happiest. I mean, it was hard often, but a relationship which I really treasured. And we met for the first time in March of 2009, and I said to him in that meeting, and I include this in the book, but I honestly don't recollect how I had thought through this particular point that I made, but I think it was an important point, because I said to him, the U.S. and China have lots of difficulties across the range of issues, and that's always been true for climate change also, but I think you and I can make climate change a positive pillar. Those were the words that I used, a positive pillar in the U.S.-China relationship, and I think we should try to do that together. And he didn't say yes, he didn't say no, and it really didn't bear fruit in 2009. It was a very cordial relationship, and we liked each other a lot right away. Didn't start to bear fruit till I'd say 2010, but if you fast forward to Paris and Xi Jinping having his bilateral meeting with President Obama, Xi Jinping started that bilateral by saying that I think climate change has become I think he said spotlight or something like that, but a key element of our relationship, which happened obviously not just because of me and Xi, because it involved Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry and Barack Obama, but it started there.
Yeah, you know that I have an anecdote with Minister Xi, when I think we were together in a dinner with Arias Cañete, the European negotiator.
Yeah.
That when mentioned to Minister Xi, look, Minister, more difficult than loss and damage, it's love and damage. And Minister Xi started to laugh in a very, very open way. So we used to have very good relations during those times.
Great, and he's a character.
Yeah, he is.
He really
Surely
is.
He is.
Yeah.
And Todd, two things around the Mayor Economic Forum, because in my point of when that started and why, and how much that was or has been the seat of connecting the climate debate into G7, G20, among some other fora, because the Mayor Economic Forum meetings started.
Oh, So the MEF you're talking about.
The MEF.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, so this is kind of interesting. Also, I had gone to, as I said before, 2 COPs back in 97 and 98. And in the period before I came back into the government, I wrote a few articles, and one of them was about creating what I called an E8, like an environmental 8, that was supposed to focus on kind of existential environmental problems, with climate change sort of first in mind. And I did that because I thought, having been to 2 COPs, I thought this is a lousy way for people to have to make progress. The ministers come and they haven't been focusing all year long. There's too many meetings, not enough time. It's just really hard to be able to have a serious, thoughtful conversation. And so we should set up a new organization. And then once we came into the government, we did that. There was a group of countries that Bush had put together, but there was no substance behind it. So we created the Major Economies Forum on climate and energy, and we met, I think, 6 times the first year, usually 3 or 4 times, and it really carried out what I had in mind from that article, which is that ministers would come, ministers would get to know the issues, they would get to like each other, it would be comfortable and friendly. And I always made sure we went to a good restaurant at night. But it was also a candor in the discussion, which was very unusual for most situations. Which is often if you have leaders and ministers come to some big meeting of 40 or 50 countries, they read their talking points and people raise their hand, and by the time you get to the person who raised their hand, it's 10 minutes later. We didn't do it that way. We allowed there to be back and forth, people jumping in and challenging each other, and that was really good. The biggest proponent of the MEF of all the countries was China.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
Good.
Minister Xia thought it was great.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yep. And let's go to Copenhagen.
Yeah.
Could we say, I'm not sure, correct me if I am wrong, that it was Copenhagen COP, which number? 2009.
No, it was 15. 15.
Yeah. COP 15. The time in which we started to have journalists putting the climate debate on the spot. So what was the role of journalists, newspapers?
Well, do you mean on the first day there?
No. During the 2 weeks of the COP 15.
Well, I mean so.
Also because of the leakage and all the news that appeared.
Yeah. So the Copenhagen was widely regarded as a complete failure, and it's still regarded that way. Not by me, not by the U.S. We had a different view, but it was certainly it was the most chaotic and dramatic and mind-bending COP that there has.
Chilly and freeze.
And chilly and freezing. That didn't make it any better. That there's ever been. But with respect to the press, it started off sort of the fun began, as it were, on Tuesday of the first week. I arrived on Wednesday morning, but the day before, there had been a leak to the Guardian newspaper of the text of a short Copenhagen Accord, which Denmark had been working on with other countries. A week before, there had been about 30 countries come to Copenhagen, half developed, half developing, to discuss the text. But this was, the leak said, a secret text, nobody has seen it. The Danes and developed countries mean to undermine the position of developing countries, take away power from developing countries, and it's a disaster and it's awful and blah, blah, blah. And that was leaked by one of our friends, and I've never said who. I'm not positive. That's why I don't say who. I have a suspicion, but I don't say who. But it was clearly a guided missile aimed at the negotiations, and it was incredibly effective. I mean, Denmark could not get anything going for the next 9 days.
Wow. That was the famous picture in the toilets of the text. I think that picture of the text.
Oh, I don't know, maybe. Yeah.
I think that it was taken in the toilet.
Yeah. It could be.
I remember that picture.
And they weren't able to get anything together until the Thursday night at 11 o'clock with basically 24 hours left. there was a dinner hosted by the Queen, and the Danes went around and gave invitations to about 25 or 30 countries, who then met starting at 11 o'clock that night, and it went all for about another 24 hours, and eventually we got a Copenhagen Accord with a lot of drama.
Yeah.
More drama.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That picture is part of the drama.
Okay. That picture is where? It's part of the...
That's part of
the
Copenhagen,
okay.
yeah.
So Todd, in your book you are describing the atmosphere in Copenhagen. But how much do you think that the difficulties in Copenhagen were created based on the fact that we still were trying to continue working with this Annex 1, non-Annex 1 reality? And how that switched into a more comprehensive
right.
global discussion.
Look, the underlying, there were two things that we couldn't have. We couldn't have a legally binding agreement that we couldn't join. But as part and parcel of that, part of that paradigm was that the division between developed and developing countries, which is written right into the original framework convention. There's nothing wrong with the fact that there are those two bodies, but there had developed, particularly starting in Kyoto, a kind of firewall between the two, so that there could be no obligations or expectations directed at developing countries and only developed. And that, again, I felt had to change over time. And I think the reason that you had so much resistance in Copenhagen is that China, India, Brazil, and South Africa had formed a group. China brought them together just about a week before the COP started, called the Basic Group, which still exists in some fashion. But the purpose of it was written up in an article in one of the Indian newspapers. I think it's the Hindu Times, I think, or the Times of India, one of those, that quoted one of the countries saying that that the purpose of their meeting was to make sure that the Copenhagen Accord, which is the short document that Denmark was then pushing, could have no traction in the actual agreement. And look, there continued to be a separation between developed and developing countries. There still is to some extent, but it started to be chipped away at. The thing that happened in Copenhagen, and the reason that we saw Copenhagen as so important, was because there was a lot more similarity between at least the major developing countries and the developed countries, and that's why it made the others so angry.
Yeah. So now let me ask you about the Copenhagen Accord. How many countries joined the Copenhagen? 6 countries developed the Copenhagen Accord by the end of the COP?
Well, so I mean,
or promoted.
The Copenhagen Accord, which is 2.5 pages long, was hammered out in that meeting after the Queen's dinner that I was talking about. It's a quite extraordinary meeting. You had about 25 world leaders sitting around a table doing what they don't expect to do. They expect to come and sign something that's all finished, or they maybe expect to come to deliver talking points that somebody read for them. They don't expect to come with 1 day left and an urgency to get something done and nothing on the table. So this was like quite dramatic in and of itself. So you eventually had the 25 or 27, however many countries were there. Following that meeting that's on the cover of the book, there was ultimately agreement among those countries. But there was a revolt in the plenary session. That's all 195 countries. You have to get there. Well, this is something that we haven't said. Again, I think most of you're here, you know this, but you need a consensus. So you need basically all the countries to agree, and you had about 10 or 15 that were violently against it. So at the end of the day, a compromise was worked out that the Copenhagen Accord was not adopted, but it would be taken note of, which was something that was very important to us, so that it would not just sink beneath the waves, disappear, and nobody would remember it, but it was a thing. It wasn't adopted, but it was a thing. And our whole strategy for the next year where the COP was in Cancun, was to get the substance of the Copenhagen Accord moved into an agreement that would actually be adopted by the COP and then be really part of the COP, and that is what happened in 2010.
And you know, I love that a thing. No? It was a thing.
Yeah,
but
it was a thing.
so important thing. You know that my comment. I remember in Peru, it was still there is a light in this low battery lantern because of the Copenhagen Accord, and
Right.
that was true.
Right.
Because which element were included there? The 100 billion, no? It was
Yeah,
included
yes,
there. The beginning of the NDC process, among some other topics.
It wouldn't have, Copenhagen Accord would not have happened without the 100 billion. There was no chance that would have happened without that. It's when all of the key developed countries, and the last one to say yes, by the way, was the United States. We had to get permission from the White House to go ahead and say yes, and that opened the door.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so then after Copenhagen, we moved into Cancun.
Yeah.
And Cancun, it was the place in which we recovered traction on the process, and in which we adopted many things that had been developed in the Copenhagen Accord in some way. That is why the creation of the Green Climate Fund is correct. It was in Cancun.
Yeah,
no?
yeah. Well, the first thing you have to know about Cancun is that the weather was really good, and
Better than Copenhagen.
Better than Copenhagen, and the whole process, from the point of view of a negotiator, was just great, because the negotiations took place on this gigantic sort of resort, and so everybody had rooms right on the grounds. You didn't have to fight your way through cabs and metros and all of that to get there, and even people didn't wear ties. I mean, it was right. They didn't wear ties. It was just a more relaxed atmosphere, which didn't make the negotiations, simple. But you're exactly right. What happened? If you look at Cancun, it's about 30 pages long compared to 2.5. But those pages are all an expansion of what was already in the Copenhagen Accord.
No. And then after Cancun, we got this second commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol, that it was so needed. But also we started with this participatory, not participatory, this kind of more non-formal dialogue through the Indabas.
Yeah.
Then we replicate that in some way with the Talanoas dialogue.
Right.
No?
Right.
So how instrumental those dialogues have been for the process?
Well, look, the thing that happened, so we've talked about 2009 and 10. 2011 was most important because it's the time when there was then still a new mandate for what became Paris, a 4-year mandate to negotiate an agreement that was legally binding, at least in some respects. I have to say that this is I've said this many times, this is the year where I kicked myself the most. I thought that we were not, the U.S. and me, that we weren't doing well enough in the first number of months of that year, because we were resistant to having a new mandate, because we were understandably worried that a mandate becomes illegally binding. We're right back in the same problem that we're trying to avoid. But there's ways to have a mandate that give you enough flexibility. So after sort of kicking myself in the pants by, June or so, we started to move in the direction. We were supportive of a new mandate. We just needed to have the mandate have aspects to it that allowed us enough flexibility to end up with an agreement like Paris, which is half legal, half not legal.
That is the mandate that defined 2013, 14, and 15, as a process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was a four-year process.
Yeah, I don't remember how it was phrasing. It was like it was open. That gave more flexibility. More flexibility to move the non-legally binding concept.
It's phrased in a way that sounds quite legally binding, but the aspects, like it doesn't specify which aspects of the agreement do or don't need to be legally binding. We didn't need it to spell out that it doesn't so much. We just needed to make sure that the decision of what would be binding and not was left open.
Yeah.
and that was the key.
Yeah, something so important in diplomacy and in a multilateral process to never prejudge the result of a
Right,
process. No,
yeah,
it is
right.
to keep it open, to
Right.
give some room for
But
negotiation.
by the same token, there was some of the Europeans in particular wanted us to not insist on to just sort of. I'm not gonna make this clear, but it was left open enough, but it was also guided enough so that we knew that the issues that we were concerned about could be addressed. Put it
Yeah.
that way. Yeah.
And then we move into Warsaw. Warsaw interesting because we got the INDCs, and it was the beginning of the loss and damage. How difficult for the U.S. it was to start that discussion around this concept of loss and damage? Because we used to think, okay, this is something that the U.S. won't accept. We won't be able to move this forward. But look where we are with loss and damage.
Yes, that's true. It was a sort of inherently hard issue because it was impossible not to be very sympathetic about the plea of poor countries and island countries. We were also concerned, again, our politics are tough in the United States, and we were worried about signing on to a kind of open-ended thing that would expose us to kind of having support for what we were negotiating, for losing support for what we were negotiating, and we were okay with loss and damage, but we didn't want it to signify legal liability or requirement for compensation, because we thought, and I think we were right, that if we had done that, we would have got crucified back at home. It would have been hard. So, but I'll tell you, I had a meeting. I had so many meetings over the years. I don't remember that many the specifics of it. But I had one meeting in Warsaw at a big table. Probably 20 people at a table, and there was me on one side, and the heads of 20 islands on the other side, and that was a hard meeting because they wanted us to be able to do more than we could do, and we were very sympathetic. One of the things that President Obama did in Paris, he met with three countries or country groups. He met with China, he met with India, and then he met with about a dozen islands, and it was a great thing to do, something that we had organized, because by that time we were working very closely with the islands.
Yeah. And then Lima came. I will leave Lima for.
Well, yeah, but Lima, this guy made Lima work, and Lima, amazingly, because a very big thing had happened before Lima, just a few weeks before Lima, between the U.S. and China, but Lima was still really difficult, and even difficult to the point where it could have looked like it might fail, and that would have been a calamity for Paris, and this guy was the leader.
Oh, thank you, Todd. And it is true, it was November the 12th, the first statement of U.S.-China, no?
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
released, because there was a second one before of Paris. But let's go to the first one.
Well,
how that was possible?
Well, so we had a pretty good year in 2013. Secretary Kerry came. He established a U.S.-China working group that was quite helpful. President Obama negotiated a small but significant climate paragraph relating to the industrial pollutant HFCs with President Xi Jinping. Good things had happened, and when fast forward to January of 2014, and Secretary Kerry asked me to come up to his office, and he basically said, what do we do for an encore? So we had a good year in 2013, now we have to do something big. So I said, give me a day, I'll talk to my staff, I'll come back tomorrow and tell you what we can do big. And the idea was to have the United States and China at the presidential level. We knew that our president would be in China in November, to have them jointly announce their targets for the new Paris Agreement, that it would give a great amount of momentum. And so I went with Kerry in February. He started talking right to Xi Jinping and others about this, and it started, but it had to be secret. The reason it had to be secret was we couldn't know for sure that Obama would be able to go forward with the Chinese until we saw the Chinese proposed numbers. And the Chinese might have felt the same way about us or not, I can't say, but we knew that we couldn't go forward if the Chinese were proposing something weak, because that would be you don't want President Obama to hug President Xi in those circumstances. So we knew we weren't going to know that till the fall. So we just had to keep the thing secret. Amazingly, it never leaked, and the announcement was made on November 12th, as you said, and it electrified the entire climate world. I mean, it was on the front page of most every paper, and it sent a message to countries all over the world who had seen failure in trying to do these kinds of agreements that go all the way back to 1995. So always full of doubt, and so many of them, including like the most antagonistic countries to the United States, said at that moment, and told me later, at that moment, we knew we could get Paris done. So it was big.
Amazing. So Lima, it is true that Lima was possible because of that November the 12th statement. Even more, the phrasing, it was repeated in the Lima call for climate action.
True, but what's also true is I was the early morning on the 12th. My friend and the current envoy for the U.S., John Podesta, were doing a press briefing by phone in a small hotel room in our hotel, and when we were done with the press briefing, I said to John, "So this might sound surprising, but we're going to have a really hard cop, because the Chinese are going to be so worried that their good friends in India and South Africa and Brazil and the so-called like-minded developing countries, which is a pretty hardline group, we're going to be upset with them, so they were going to have to be really tough in Lima." So I said to John, "Don't think it's going to be easy in Lima, it's going to be tough."
Yeah.
And it was.
But we alleviate the tension with pisco sour.
That's true.
That was fantastic.
Thank God for pisco sours, that's true.
and before of moving to Paris, something that we also did in Lima, beyond or aside the negotiation, it was the action agenda. No, when we brought for the first time ever the non-state actors into the table. How instrumental do you think that was to the process or to move toward the Paris Agreement?
Well, I think it was really important for a process that was important for Paris, but is important all the way to now. I mean, that was the beginning of really expanding the role of non-state actors, of companies and NGOs and others, and then the French picked that up in a big way and pushed that further. And you can look at the COPs that have happened ever since. More and more and more people. The green zones have become very large, and it's important that that's true, because you don't get climate action. You can have targets and all the rest, but you don't get action just on the basis of governments. You need to have companies getting on board. You need to have NGOs and subnational players, and all of that really started with Lima.
That's true. And Todd, then we move into Paris, and I don't remember the date on the second statement, U.S.-China statement.
Oh, that was in September.
That was in September. Yeah. And why that statement was released? Because it was needed to create more momentum to Paris, or to complement missing pieces?
No, not that so much. Xi and I agreed to negotiate that in April. And we met pretty much once a month all the way to September. And we just wanted to see what difficult issues could we find common ground on the way to Paris, so we didn't have everything facing us in Paris, so that we knew we had already agreed to these 5 lines on transparency, which became super important in the Paris article on transparency and so forth. So that was all about what brush can we clear away so that we can just concentrate on what's left.
And let me share with you, I love this, page 165, a dialogue in between President Obama and Todd. President Obama: "Hi Todd, how it's going?" Todd: "It's going to be tough. It's always tough." President Obama: "It's always tough. Saving the planet, it is not every day you get to save the planet, and you don't even have a cape." And you respond, "I left it at home." But you left it, or it was under your jacket?
No, believe me, it was not under my jacket. Yeah, that was Obama's humor.
But also, this phrase showed his willingness in getting something in Paris, despite of how tough it would be.
Obama was absolutely determined. The only thing that Obama was a little disappointed about in Paris, and he had been the difference maker in Copenhagen. He had come and he had negotiated those last two points, and he really liked that. You know, Obama's a super smart guy. He likes to get into it, and the only thing he was sort of disappointed in was that he didn't have a role like that in Paris. And the thing that was particularly funny related to that is we were at one point outside of the holding room where he was, and waiting for a meeting to start with. I think Xi Jinping with Modi, and I'm looking around for Obama, and all of a sudden I see him. He's in the hallway. He's talking to the minister from Javadekar from India, and they're having a lively debate about some issue of developing countries. And Javadekar looked like a kid in a candy store. I mean, he was so excited to be having this debate with President Obama, and I think Obama was getting into it just because he was missing the chance to have some action.
Okay, Paris. Let's go to Paris. So, what made Paris possible? Fabius, it was so instrumental, so smart in managing. You know that I am always thinking that also he made people feel so comfortable by putting some topics in the preamble, by accommodating pieces in the agreement. That is correct?
Yeah.
He did it great.
No, I think that there were a bunch of factors that played into Paris getting done. One was that there had been a lot of time. I mean, if you compare that to the rush to try to get a Copenhagen Accord done, part of the problem there was countries were not ready for that. They didn't know where this was coming from. They'd been doing their own negotiation, and suddenly this thing was like dropped down from the skies, so they were upset about that. Here, there had been a lot of time. Countries had gotten used to the different issues that were getting discussed. As you said, back in Warsaw, that there were some of the first important agreements made on the kinds of sort of landing places on issues. So that was much further along. It's also true that countries care tremendously, particularly smaller countries, care tremendously about multilateralism. I mean, that's their chance to have a voice. And if this agreement, if we had come so far, and you had the U.S. and Chinese presidents saying we're going to get this done, and here's what we're going to do, if all of that happened and then you still failed, it would have been terrible. So you had a real desire, a deep desire to have this work. And then you had tremendous skill from the French. I mean, Fabius was great. Laurence Toubiana and her team under Fabius were very good. And they listened to everybody. There was never like a secret other draft that they were working on. Fabius came, they still called them indabas in Paris, and Fabius would come 2 or 3 times. Imagine a big rectangular table with 100 people around it, and a new draft text had come out, and he wanted to listen to everybody's complaints, and he's writing down notes. People saw that. People saw that and anybody who needed to come in to see them could come, and all that made a big difference.
How important it is to have a visible president of COP, no?
Yeah.
Because the president of COP, it is a very well-respected figure, but also that needs to be visible to transmit quietness.
Absolutely,
no? Management.
Yeah, definitely.
Let me ask something about the 1.5. Actually, the well below 2 degrees. It was difficult to get that part of the text?
Yeah, so at that time, it's interesting because science changed a lot in the years after Paris, but at that time, the real proponent of some reference to 1.5 was the islands. That actually goes all the way back to Copenhagen also. But the main negotiation was over strengthening the 2-degree reference, so well below it was better than what it was before, which is below, so it means something more. And then there just needed to be enough countries, and there were, including the U.S. and many others, who said basically a best efforts language for 1.5 would work. The interesting thing is that as a result of a little remarked upon small phrase in Paris, called for an agreement, study to be done by the IPCC, the science body, a report on the impact of 1.5 and the impact of 1.5 as compared to 2, and to do that in 2018. And the IPCC did that, and it landed with tremendous force and really started a movement in terms of how people in the climate world saw the goal that we should be embracing from 2 to 1.5. It doesn't mean we're going to make it to 1.5 now, but that was the start of a real shift toward 1.5.
Okay, we don't have too much more time, but let me move into what's next, that it is the last part of the book. You are mentioning how much we are evolving in technology, that it is fantastic, and then in policies. Let me go into policies. Why you are recognizing that evolution? Because look, in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, that for me is an amazing law.
Right.
And it's so strange that it is called Inflation Reduction Act, and it is mostly a climate one. But
Yes.
it is a good connection with some of the main concerns of the US citizens, inflation.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it's called what it's called because of politics, and the U.S. still has lots of politics. And in order to get enough people to vote for it, I mean, I wasn't in the government doing this, but the way I always read it was call it something that people are going to like, and members of Congress are going to like, and that worked. It's an incredible law. I mean, it's the most important piece of legislation ever in the U.S. There have been literally hundreds of billions of dollars are out the door, investments in clean energy all over the country, and most of those are going to survive the new regime, the Trump regime, because they are mostly done by way of tax credits. It's hard, and most of the actual investment happens in what we call red states in the U.S., which is to say Republican. So if you think that Republican governors, mayors, senators, congressmen are going to want to lose the money that's coming in, the jobs that are coming in, the new industries that are getting built in their states, in order to make Donald Trump happy, you're wrong. They're not going to want to do that. So I think it'll be hard to roll those. Trump will try to roll some things back, but he won't roll the heart of the IRA back. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and also the United States, it has this bipartisan infrastructure law, no? That it is to update infrastructure and to...
Also important, and another law called the CHIPS Act, and both of those are, I mean, the most important is the IRA, and the second most is infrastructure, but CHIPS, which is more to have to do with computer chips, but that also has some elements in there that are relevant for climate.
But in your book, you are also referring to some obstacles. Fossil fuels, phasing out fossil fuels, something that it has been recognized in the UAE consensus, but for sure this needs more development, more efforts. Why it's an obstacle?
Well, so I mean, the part of the book that you're talking about, I basically say I think if you look forward at the landscape of climate change, I see three main factors. One is that the impacts are worse and harder than we had ever expected, or that scientists had expected. Second, that there's been spectacular progress with respect to the green transition. And so much progress that we could probably get sort of near where we're supposed to be in 2030 if there were no obstacles, but guess what? There are obstacles. And the biggest obstacle, in my judgment, is the fossil fuel industry, both for what it does and for the influence that it has on governments. And that's a big challenge. There was incredibly important language, really important language last year in Dubai in the global stock take language that talks about transitioning away from fossil fuels in a manner consistent with the 2050 goals. What are the 2050 goals? It's to 1.5 or as close as you can get to that, and net zero carbon. So net zero emissions. So you know, that's great language, but I will tell you the fossil fuel industry is not going to lay down and do what they're supposed to do without more force.
But even financial sector, no? Because you referred as those key obstacles, fossil fuels, and the needed reform to the financial sector.
Well, not so much of the financial sector, but there needs to be reform of finance that is going to the global south, because not nearly enough does. It's a part of the discussion that's going on, sort of the biggest part of the discussion that's going on in this COP, the so-called NCQG. But really, and that's important, and we got to get that done and landed so we don't have a failure on our hands for this COP. But there's also a tremendous amount of the actual work, I think the biggest part of the work, that is partly happening and needs to happen more in the G20, where the kinds of reforms to the multilateral development banks and the World Bank that could really generate hundreds of billions of dollars can happen, but it's got to happen over there, not over here, because guess what? There's not much financial expertise here.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Let me finish with this question. You are referring to political tipping point. What do you mean with political tipping point?
So, okay, so go.
Denialism, polarization, it is part of it.
So go back to what I was saying about the importance of getting past fossil fuels, and what we need is, so you need action that is that. Let me put it this way to be simple. Politicians will act when they believe that not acting can get them into political trouble, right? That's the way that's the way you can move politicians. We're not there yet. Most politicians in a lot of countries, not just the US, don't think they have to do all that much on climate change. The public is going to have to weigh in there. We need political will, but again, the political will, I think, sometimes you're just going to have good leaders and they've got the political will, but a lot of times you're going to not have enough. When I talk about that kind of tipping point, I mean people, leaders and citizens have to start pushing in a different way. And I give one example of a time that this has happened in a spectacular way, which is 1970, the original Earth Day in the United States. There was a Democratic senator from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, thought he could capitalize on the activism of young people and people young at heart with respect to Vietnam and women's rights and civil rights and so forth, and that there was a growing environmental consciousness, not enough, but he wanted to escalate that. And so he said, we should have a teach-in, which I can attest is a word from the 1960s. And so he did that, and on Earth Day, 20 million people came out. I mean, that's completely shocking. 20 million people, and guess what happened? In the 2 years after that, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, the Clean Water Act was passed, the Clean Air Act was passed, and all of this under the presidency of the not very liberal Richard Nixon. And then for the rest of the 70s, also more environmental stuff. That was because politicians saw 20 million people in the street calling for action. We don't have that yet, but we need to get there.
Amazing. So a last, more logistical question. So this is a book that deserves to be read. You will enjoy it. I have done it. I enjoy it, and thank you, Todd. It has been already published. Where to get a copy? Could you? Oh
well, you can, Amazon or anywhere else. I honestly, when I was coming here, I thought I want to bring a big box of books so that everybody who comes here, I can give away a book and I can sign the book. And I thought, how the hell am I going to get a box of books into the venue? And I wanted to do it, but it just was not doable. But yes, you can buy it on Amazon or any other kind of place that you like, and yeah, please.
Good, fantastic.
Please
so
go
remember,
ahead.
Landing the Paris Climate Agreement by Todd Stern. Go into, read it, go deeply, look how the climate diplomacy it is used to being developed. What are the obstacles? What are the ways that you can push the process forward? So let me finish by thanking you, Todd, and by saying something important. So it is true, you don't have the cape,
no,
but you are back as Clark Kent. So So thank you for all your effort in this climate debate. Thank you for leaving a legacy through this book, because I think that we have to always build upon. We have to continue progressing on. No, sometimes the human being, we are thinking that we are starting from scratch. That is not correct.
Right.
We are always progressing.
Right.
So thank you very much, Todd.
Thank you. Thank everybody for coming and everybody watching. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, all right.
And thank you for being here.